This is serious stuff. There's no doubt the Australian public is starting to wake up to China. Only today, in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump has said that America's very significant contributions to the World Health Organization will be halted. I made comments last week about the appalling decision of China to reopen its wet markets. This led to an extraordinary outburst in the Chinese Global Times newspaper, where several pages of a story were dedicated to accusing me of fabricating facts, lying and being a racist. Good luck to them. But remember the story in late January, early February? Chinese-owned property developers, Greenland Australia and Risland Australia, purchasing more than 100 tonnes of medical equipment from Australian suppliers and then flew all the gear to China. My understanding is the bloke behind this is a former Chinese People's Liberation Army officer, Quang Yang Ping. The transportation of all this stuff was coordinated, apparently, by Mr. Quang, and he most probably made a tidy profit, because at the time reports suggested that a company run by Mr. Quang purchased the medical equipment from Australian suppliers, jacked up the price on some of it by 300%, on-sold the overpriced gear to Risland, which then flew it to China. And this bloke, Mr. Quang, is a former People's Liberation Army officer who runs several Chinese Communist Party-backed organisations in Sydney and Melbourne. Then you might recall a story of a person going to Chatswood to do some shopping. The lady who went shopping decided to post something. She went to the Australia Post Office in Chatswood. The man at the post office told her she'd have to find another post office because there they only send items to China. And if you go to the Australia Post Office, everything's in Chinese. No business for Australians, and the store shelves are packed with a variety of products, baby formula, vitamins, milk powder, blackboards and so on. And these post offices support what are called Daigous, who are professional shoppers who purchase products and ship them to clients back in China. China, of course, then sell them at a marked up price. And there are 150,000 of these Daigous across Australia, professional shoppers who purchase product to be shipped back to China. One international student who lives in Melbourne said she would mail between 70 to 100 packages a week. She's a student. She spends up to 15 hours a day taking orders from overseas clients on a social media app, WeChat. And this Risland outfit is a totally owned subsidiary of Country Garden Holdings, which is one of China's largest property developers. The Greenland Group. Oh, by the way, you'll notice how they have these lovely Australian names. They're always Greenland Australia and Risland Australia. But this Greenland is a Chinese government-backed developer based here in Australia. At the peak of the crisis in China, they flew 80 tonnes of medical supplies on a private jet. They cleaned us out. When the virus hit here, we were left to scramble for supplies. We're mugs with a capital M. Well, we spoke to Andrew Hastie about a lot of this stuff last week. He had raised last year the point about China and Russia, that they'd weaponised previously benign areas such as diplomacy, media investment flows, infrastructure development and foreign asset purchases, and that university campuses had become model battlegrounds of covert influence and interference. Remember, we've sold everything that's worth buying to China: beef farms, dairy farms, avocado farms, water, coal, iron ore, the port of Darwin. 2 plane loads of dairy products leave Tasmania every week from our paddock onto their plate. And then remember, we had this bloke, Shoket Mosselmain, a Labor member of the New South Wales Parliament, praising President Xi's unswerving leadership in handling the coronavirus crisis, that he, quote, mustered the resources of the nation and together with the great people of China fought it and contained it. He said, historically, China has longed for greatness and the rules of the game continue to favour its opponents. He said, this is a Labor MP, the rules have to change. The only way for China to reach its potential is for China to force a change to the rules and create a new world order. One wonders if the virus hasn't done the job. Well, Richo and I love talking to talented, new, young people. Alex Antic, A-N-T-I-C, is a Liberal senator in South Australia. He only began his term last year. He's believed to be the first senator of Serbian descent. His father, who left war-torn Yugoslavia in the 1950s, became the director of thoracic medicine at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Senator Alex Antic graduated from the University of Adelaide with degrees in law and arts. He was a senior associate for many years. He also served on the Adelaide City Council for 4 years. I'm told he's very smart. I've never met him. But he's had some very strong, sensible things to say about many issues. China is one of them. Only a fortnight ago, he raised concerns about China's handling of the coronavirus issue. He's got plenty to say, I think, and it's worth listening to him, but he's a new voice and a new face. And here he is, Senator Alex Antich. Good evening to you. Good to talk to you. I suppose...
Good evening, Alan.
You know a bit about war and repression from your family, Serbia. What would your father think, having escaped from war-torn Yugoslavia, to see now China cherry-picking the best of Australia for themselves?
Well, Alan, it's an interesting point you raise. I often reflect upon what my grandma used to say about these sorts of situations as well. And as a young kid, listening to stories of wartime Europe, they don't really reflect on you very much when you're living in such a fantastic country as Australia. But she used to always be cautious of the need to be able to be mobile, and the ability to be able to adapt very quickly. And I think what we're seeing now is a new chapter in Australia-China relations. And I think all of the things you've described earlier on this afternoon are quite right. We need to, I think, take stock of how we relate back to the Chinese Communist Party, how we deal with sovereign interests, and how we deal with our supply chains. Here in South Australia, many years ago, 1948, around about the time that my father and his mother came to this country, we used to manufacture important medical supplies here. Fauldings used to have a factory in South Australia. They used to manufacture penicillin. We don't do that anymore. And I think if anything comes from this, it'll show that we are at risk, and we do need to reassess those supply chains.
You're saying that Australia should seek compensation for the damage the pandemic has had on the economy. Who is going to make China take responsibility? As you say, all of this began in a wet market in Wuhan, in conditions you've described as filthy, disgusting havens of disease, with animals stacked upon each other and cages. Well, now these wet markets have opened again. So who's going to make China pay the bill?
Well, that is the $1 trillion question. I think suggestion, I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party are responsible. One way or another, they either began in these wet markets. We're now hearing reports that they may have actually originated in a lab. There was a report today in the Washington Post. Now, they're all speculative, but what we do know is China were complicit in the cover-up, and in fact, they have formed. 2003, after the SARS outbreak, the world community got together and formed the 2005 International Health Regulations, and they were largely signed up for this very purpose, and that was to ensure that sovereign nations rang the alarm bell when events like this happened. China didn't do that. Not only did they not do that, they actually actively covered it up and continue to do so. I mean, to date, the United States experts still cannot get access to the samples of the original virus to determine where it came from, and of course that informs how we deal with it in future. Now, the question of who actually would enforce some sort of international judgment or whatever it may be, that's the $1 million question. I note that the former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer had some comments today in today's Adelaide Advertiser where he said, as I have said, that the G7 nations would have to form some sort of unique compact, some coalition of the willing. That's about the only way you can see it. But one of the ways that I think really could be used...
Can I just say, wait a minute, that would be a huge step. To form that compact, each one of those nations has a big trading relationship with China. Every nation has that today. Who's going to have the courage to stand up and risk that? Because the Chinese are going to have to fight. They can't sit back and let the world shun them. They'd have to fight back, wouldn't they?
Yeah, look, that's the $1 trillion question, and you're absolutely right, Richo. And look, I think there may be other ways. I mean, I think there is an issue of accountability here, and if it's not a monetary outcome, then certainly we need to make accountability is found so that this doesn't happen again. But look, it may well be simple things like I noticed Japan have put a $2 billion plan together in order to bring manufacturing back to Japan. I see us, in effect, reclaiming some of the output by bringing manufacturing back to Australia as we can do. High-tech manufacturing, high wages have historically been an issue, but look, Germany do it, and if Germany can do it from a high-tech point of view, I don't see why we can. And in fact, I think it's imperative. We need to be more self-sufficient than we are. This incident has certainly shown that we are vulnerable.
Senator Antich, just on that last point you make, is a very valid point. You see, we've gone nuts over this free trade agreements everywhere, which aren't fair trade. I mean, the biggest problem we face is the quality of life we seek for our workers. We pay them wages to secure that quality of life. The countries we're trading with pay nothing like that. Now, don't we have to review this whole free trade agreement? The world's laughing at us. I mean, the cost of living, the cost of wages in places like South Korea and China are something that put our manufacturers at tremendous disadvantage. Are you confident that you're going to, all this stuff in your party, your government, is going to be laid out on the table to be reviewed now in the light of what we've seen here?
Well, I think it's going to be a long process. I think there are a whole heap of steps that need to happen in between there. Obviously, there is the issue of, potentially IR-style reforms, but I think we need to get back to bringing manufacturing back. We talked a lot about being a resource capital, and I noticed that Andrew Hastie said earlier on today's program, and Chris Kenny's program, that we should be an energy superpower. They're the sort of industries where I think we can bring a lot of that stuff back, certainly the manufacturing, but also the mining and resources. This is not going to happen overnight, but Germany lead the way. They're a great example of a mechanised, industrialised nation that have high wages and still manage to manufacture goods. They can do it. I don't see why we can't.
Well, just come back to your first point.
The trouble always is that the economists will line up and tell you can't do it. That's what worries me. They line up and tell you can't do it. It's not rational. That's the great word. And therefore, if you're against them, you're irrational, and they beat you on that every time.
Well, I think on that, I just want to come back, though, to Alex Antic, what you said earlier, and I quote you exactly. You said it's still way too early to quantify the damages which will flow from this event. But the impost upon the Australian economy will be in the billions, if not trillions of dollars. And you say seeking compensation from China is something which governments must explore. So notwithstanding what Graham is saying, and he's quite right, governments are going to have to grow a bit of a spine here. Stop shopping at Kmart.
Look, that's exactly right, and that is the point. Ultimately, we have, as a society, become very, very used to cheap goods, and look, there was a time, once again, in South Australia here, we manufactured white goods, we manufactured fridges and all sorts of white goods. I know times have changed. I know that the wages, sorts of reasons why we can't do it, and I know, and Graham's quite right with his comment about what economists will say. But I think we need to pick and choose what we're good at and what we're not good at. Now, we won't be able to manufacture everything. We don't manufacture cars anymore. But look, we need to readdress manufacture and bring some of those jobs. I think, part of the issue.
Yeah, Alex, what would happen? This is really pub stuff. Without the economists and all the fancy theory, 250,000 public servants in Canberra giving all this fashionable advice. What would happen if countries around the world said, listen, we've had a gutful. Now, from this day on, we will forfeit all debt that we owe to China. The lot of us. Hey, it's a pretty simple story. You say to the other bloke, hey, listen, I know I owe you money, but you've just cost me millions. To hell with you. I'm not paying the money back. That's the way it had happened in the marketplace. What's wrong with countries? International? Do we lack the guts, the fibre, the understanding to do it?
Well, I think it comes from a position of being a middle power. I think we would need, certainly, we're a middle power, we're a trading nation. The United States can do its own version of events and we need to do our own. But look, I don't see why not. That was the original point. I don't see why not. With a coalition of the willing, there couldn't be pressure put on. And look, in life, if you don't ask, you don't get. It may well be there's another outcome that comes from it.
That's it. You said the Chinese inaction, I'm just quoting your words, this is outstanding stuff, represents more than a breach of morality. You said it may well be a breach of international law and the legally binding 2005 international health regulations. And if so, China will have an obligation to pay. Now, those health regulations, am I right, Senator, require international entities to report developments such as these when they happen, and China did not do that.
Precisely right. And in fact, as I said earlier, that is exactly what they were originally crafted for, was as a result of the SARS outbreak in 2003, they were generated for that exact purpose, in order to keep countries honest effectively and make sure that they were reporting these sorts of pandemics as they came forward. I think the problem is now that the world community sees China putting its hand up for being a world leader. But the reality is we really can't trust anything coming out of the regime's mouthpiece. So how do we move forward if we can't already get the answers that we are requiring here? There needs to be some pressure from the international community on China as a result of what's happening.
And I think one point we should make here, and I know you've made it, we're not attacking Chinese people. You've said the Chinese are hardworking and decent people, but they're let down by the authoritarian regime under which they live, And you say right now the most important consideration is the health of the Australian people and our economy. But in the longer term, you've said Australians will be right to ask why China shouldn't pay for their actions. Where do we go from here?
Well, look, I think we need to get over the immediate health and economic consequences, but I think that the world community needs to ask that question. Look, it may well be, we hear reports from the US of people filing their own class actions. Look, that's just not where it's going to go. It's going to be diplomatic pressure. It's going to be asking the question through the relevant bodies and potentially the international courts. But ultimately, I think we need to take a good hard look at how we now relate to the Chinese communist regime. We are very reliant, and as you say, this is no reflection upon the Chinese people. This is about the regime under which they live. And look, at the end of the day, we do have, I think, an obligation here to ask these questions, because the most important thing out of all of this is putting pressure on the Chinese Communist Party so this doesn't happen again. End of story.
Look, call me a cynic, but I just can't see myself sitting here reading all the things that the Chinese admit and then make reparations for. It won't happen. I wish it would. It certainly should. But who makes them pay? Who puts the gun to the head of the Chinese? Can't see anyone doing it.
Yeah, look, I think that's right.
Well, I've just got to say to you, Senator Antic, it's been a pleasure listening to you. I don't know you, but I tell you what, we're grateful there are people of your ability and intellectual courage who are now in the National Parliament. Thank you for your time, and I hope we can talk again.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Richard. Thanks very much.
Here was South Australian Liberal Senator Alex Antic.
He's good.